Hello everyone, and welcome to Cloud Automation Guide, where we simplify DevOps, cloud, and automation for everyone. If you're building a self-service cloud environment but want more control over how users request resources, you're in the right place. Because in this video, we're going to explore one of the most impactful tools in VMware Aria Automation, Catalog Item Custom Forms. Let's get started. So what are custom forms? Let's start from the basics. Custom forms are user-friendly overlays in Service Broker that sit on top of your catalog items. Instead of using the default auto-generated form, which exposes every input from your cloud template, you can tailor the interface to match your user's needs. Here's why your custom forms are so powerful. You can simplify complex inputs by hiding or pre-filling fields. You can add input validation to prevent user errors. You can group related fields or tabs into sections to make it easier for users to fill out the forms. And most importantly, you can guide your users through a clean, intuitive request process. All of this is done without changing the underlying YAML blueprint. In order to create custom forms, first you're going to have to log into the Aria Automation console and click on the Service Broker service. From there, you're going to click Content and Policies and Content. Please note that you do need to have at least one cloud template created, versioned, and released to the catalog. And also you need to have a content source configured in order to be able to see any content here in the Service Broker. But if you do, you can choose whichever catalog item it is that you're wanting to enable content, custom forms for. Click the three vertical dots and then click Customize Form. This is the custom form designer. You'll notice on the left-hand side, you have request inputs. These are inputs which are pulled in directly from your cloud template. Then below that, you have something called generic elements. Generic elements are elements which are available to all cloud templates and custom forms. You can do all sorts of things with these, like you can create drop-down menus, you can include an image, you can input a text field, etc. So you don't have to have anything defined on your cloud template in order to be able to use these. You can just drag and drop. In here in the middle, this is more like your canvas where you can actually kind of build out your custom form. Notice here you can add a tab if you want, and you can drag elements onto that, and then the user will be presented this whenever they look at the custom form. Over on the right-hand side, when you select an element, or an input field rather, it then populates it over on the right-hand side to where you can do things like set whether or not the input field is visible, set whether or not it's read-only, define any custom help signposts that you want to provide to the user in the form of like an information icon. You can also specify default values if you want. If you want to provide options to the users for values, like maybe a drop-down list, you can either manually specify it yourself, or you can use some sort of like an Aria orchestrator action, or end up using what's the defaults that are built into Aria Automation. For instance, the project that is dependent upon the user who's actually launching the custom form. It will automatically populate that, and that is actually an internal external source for this. You can click on constraints, and you can set whether or not that the field is required. For some built-in fields like the project field, it's automatically required. It has to be populated, so you can't do anything with that. But maybe like your virtual machine name down here, if you wanted, you could say, no, it's not required, or the deployment name. In this case, these are all mandatory fields out of the box, so you have no choice but to fill these out. But if you wanted to provide something like a text field down here and you went to constraints, you can see that you can set it yes, no. You can also set regular expressions. Many of these properties you can actually set on the cloud template itself, on the input fields on the cloud template. And if you do, those values will show up in here, and then you can modify them here if you need to. You also have another section over here called validations. Validations are where you would use like an orchestrator action if you wanted to, and then you would be able to define the validation and then basically use it to perform more complex validations. So for instance, on the virtual machine name, you can perform a regular expression validation on the field and basically say uh, what what it has to equal. In other words, you can set a regular expression that says it has to have 15 characters, either all lowercase or all upper or mixtures of just, A through Z, a certain set of numbers in a certain format, and you can actually set that here in the custom form. So that way when the user goes to fill out the form, then it has to meet a certain criteria. So, and that's how you can perform validation. But if you're wanting to do something like I have, a request form, not for a virtual machine, but maybe it's to change a password on an Active Directory account. Well, typically you're going to basically say, I need you to provide, you know, 2 input fields, or in this case, we have down here a password. I'll have you provide a password, and I'll have you provide another password, and then I have to have an um, external action which validates the values of both of those fields to make sure that they're the same. And then what we'll do is we'll take one of those fields and then we'll pass it on to whatever it is that, is actually doing the password update. But we don't want them to provide, oops, I fat fingered this one, and then I provided the valid one down here without providing some sort of external validation to make sure that, everything is kosher. Also, what you can do is you can actually, in addition to the different types of inputs are basically the user selects an input, or the user will manually specify a value, like they will actually type it in, or you can have some sort of, like we saw an example of a drop-down field. Let me see if I can find it. So you have like a drop-down menu, and then you would define what the options are. So I would say val1 first value, val1 second value, val2, right? And then when the user goes to actually be able to select the values from it, once we save and create and enable this, right? And then if we were to go request it, right? Now we have a drop down, and the user can provide a drop down, or they can manually type something in like this, right? There's a couple different ways that they can provide information. Another way that you can actually populate field data is either using what's called an external action, which would be using an action from Aria Orchestrator to generate values, or you can also do what's called a bind, which basically says this field equals this other field. So for instance, if I was to say I want my deployment name to equal my virtual machine name, then what I can say is on my deployment, I'm going to say its value. I'm going to bind it. So you have a constant, a conditional value, meaning this equals some, hard value if something else on the canvas equals something, right? Equals, doesn't equal, contains, starts with all these values, all these possible conditional statements here. So if this field meets one of these statements, then the value of deployment name will equal hard value or hard val, just on this example. Or what you can do is instead of setting a conditional value, I can set a bind field and I can say the value of the deployment name is going to equal the value of the virtual machine name. That's also a possibility. Another one that I like to use for deployments is deployments and virtual machine names. They don't necessarily have to match. I do this a lot of times for customers when basically it's the deployment is going to only be comprised of a single virtual machine, and a lot of times for customers they want to be able to quickly, without looking at, digging in and looking at the contents of each one of the deployments, they want to be able to quickly identify which deployment has which virtual machine. And so what I'll do is I'll set the deployment name equal to the virtual machine name. But I will also, there is the possibility sometimes, and especially in lab environments, where virtual machine names can be the same. So especially if it's kind of like a sandboxed lab type setup where each user or each customer for the lab gets their own sandbox environment and they can name their stuff whatever they want. So if they want to name the deployment name equal that, then you have a little bit of an issue because Aria Automation will only let you deploy, make deployments that have unique names. So one way that I solve that is I actually incorporate like date time formats. And so what we're going to do here for this example, just to show you how that works, is I'm going to create a text field format or text field here, and I'm going to change its label to just current date, right? And then I'm going to actually set its value to an orchestrator action that I currently have, which is right here. It's called get date. And basically, I want to show you here two things. Is I'm not actually going to be using this input parameter in my code, but I want to show you kind of a best practice to keep this code from executing should something not be populated. If you have an action that requires an input and that input doesn't have a value, your code can run. It will run as soon as the custom form loads if you don't prevent it from running. The only way that you can prevent it from running is essentially have an if statement that says, if my input parameter has a value, then execute. If not, don't. Another option would be, regardless of whether or not the input parameter has a value or not, you could be returning a default value, for instance. So like if you had some sort of setup that was saying, I want to create like an organizational name, but the organizational name depends upon what value they select from another input field. And you would have your code that basically says if they select this, then the organizational name is something else. However, you could say, but by default, the organizational name will always be X until the user provides a value, and then I can return them Y or Z or A or B. So that's another way to do it. If you don't want to return a default value, then just do a simple if statement that validates that your parameter actually has an input. If it does, then execute. If it doesn't, don't execute. So for this use case, what we're going back here is what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in the request form, I'm going to provide a name for the virtual machine. When I do that, it's going to execute my action, which will get the current date. And then I'm going to set my deployment name to be equal to a computed value. And that computed value is going to be equal to my virtual machine name plus a dash plus the date. So I'm going to say virtual machine name plus, I will do a space and a dash and a space plus my date. And now I need to make sure that my date field is pulling information from my orchestrator action. So I put in the name of the action, and you'll notice that it's actually asking me for an input. And that is because I have defined an input right here on the action itself. So what am I looking for? Well, in this case, I'm looking for the virtual machine name, even though I'm not going to use it, but I just want to show you what happens to this field before and after I actually update this virtual machine name. So by default, your custom form is not enabled. It was enabled because I was doing some testing before I started this video. So once you make all of your first edits, the first thing that you have to do is save and then click enable. And now your custom form's enabled. And for good measure, just make sure you save again and make sure that this enabled is green. And now your custom form's enabled. So now you can come and click consume. Click on the catalog item that you're going to be testing with. Notice I have no date. But as soon as I put something in here, my code will execute and I get a date. And now my deployment name is my VM name with a space dash space and the result of the date. So that's just a little bit about custom forms. There is a lot to them. I encourage you to please take a look at the official documentation at Broadcom Tech Docs on Aria Automation underneath the service broker section. There's a lot of information. The one thing is it's good about the catalog item custom forms is when you start working with Aria Orchestrator, you can also use custom forms there as well. And that comes into play really, especially when you want to start doing things like creating orchestrator workflows and making them available as, through content sources to be able to execute workflows. So you can use custom forms there as well. You can use custom forms both within Orchestrator and you can use custom forms within Service Broker on the Orchestrator workflow like we just saw. So you can also do the same thing for day two actions. A day two action on a virtual machine, there's a bunch of stuff that's out of the box, but you can also create, this is a little bit more advanced, but you can also create orchestrator actions and import them into Aria Automation and make them available as a day two action on a virtual machine. So when a virtual machine gets deployed, you can go to the menu. I don't believe I have any deployment. Actually, I do have a deployment. So just real side trail real quick. This is my virtual machine. I can click the menu and I can see a whole bunch of stuff here. These are everything that's out of the box. But should I want to do something like maybe with a network, I want to re-IP the system for some reason. That's not available by default. So I can create an orchestrator action that will re-IP, like I would take like what's my virtual machine as an input, and then what's my IP address that I want to set as an input, and then have a bunch of code over here, which will then update the IP on that virtual machine. And so I then take that action and I make it available in Aria Orchestrator, or I'm sorry, Aria Automation Center, and then that will show up in the menu. And then I can also then format using a custom form, the input form on that menu. So there's a lot that you can do with it. It's very flexible. It can be complicated. Just take it in small chunks. Take a little bit at a time. Do your iterative testing. Every time you make a change, do a test. Make sure it's all working. And yeah, just have fun. So that basically wraps up this guide to catalog item custom forms in Aria Automation. Basically, whether you're managing a small amount of templates or hundreds, it's a great user experience starts with the form. Get the forms right, and make the users make it easy on the users, and then won't have much problems getting people to really start using the environment. If you like this video, I ask that you please give it a like. If you want to get more videos and stay up to date, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're looking for downloadable content to use in your Aria automation efforts, head on over to cloudautomationguide.com, where you will find all sorts of usable content to help you in your automation efforts. Until next time, keep automating.